Good morning everyone, and thank you for joining me in this updated tutorial for the Nikon Z6 and Z7. Over the past several weeks, we have heard from so many of you requesting that we do a full crash course on these cameras, and I'm thrilled to announce that that is underway. This course, the YouTube version, is really limited to the operation of the camera, some suggested settings, enough to help you get started. It's not going to be enough for a beginning or an intermediate photographer to go out and really take advantage of all the tools in the Z6 and Z7. That's what the crash course is for. It's going to cover the photography basics, composition, lighting, digital files, planning and preparation, and then we take the camera into real world shooting situations where I show you how to operate it to take portraits or to shoot sports or to do landscape photography. We talk about time-lapse and some of the tools built into the cameras. Analog with an HDMI recorder. We even talk about the new focusing tools built into the menu systems. There's a half-hour course on strobe use, and we spend over an hour talking about the video techniques. So absolutely loaded with information. If you are looking for something specific in this video in terms of operation of the camera, be sure to use the search feature in your browser. It's like Command F on Macs. Type in the word of the subject that you're looking for. It should jump to that in the table of contents, and it'll be next to the time code where you can hit that and it'll jump to the lesson in the video. It's a really kind of a quick way to navigate. So in any event, we have a ton of information to cover, so let's get started. First, let's go over all the external buttons and ports so you know exactly which does what, and you will know what I'm talking about as we progress through the tutorial. The most important button on your camera is the shutter button. And as on most cameras, this is a two-phase button, meaning that it has two depths of activation. The first is a halfway depression, which you're going to feel as a spongy resistance. This is going to focus the image depending on where your focus square is on your viewfinder or your monitor. Pushing it down all the way is going to take the picture. Take the time to train your finger to know the difference between these two positions. Around the shutter button is the power button, which turns the camera on or off. To the left of that, we have the video record button, which stops and starts video recording. To the right of that, we have the ISO control button, which allows us to change the sensitivity of the sensor, and I'll demonstrate this a little bit later. To the right of that, we have the exposure compensation button, which will allow us to change the brightness of our images in the P, S, or A modes. Just to the south of those buttons, we have the main command dial, which I sometimes call the rear command dial. The control panel will display critical shooting information such as exposure settings and number of shots remaining. On the front of the camera, just below the shutter button, we have the sub-command dial, but I also call it the front command wheel. Close to where our right ring finger would rest, we have the FN1 and FN2 buttons, which are both customizable. On the opposite side of the camera, we have the lens release button, which we will need to press every time we put a lens on or off the camera. Just above it, near the top of the camera, we have the autofocus assist lamp, which can help our camera focus in low light. On the top left of the camera, we have the mode dial, which allows us to tell the camera which exposure settings we want to control and which ones we want to turn over to the camera. The post we see in the middle of the mode dial is a safety lock, and we'll need to depress this every time we change our shooting mode. I'll be talking about the mode dial in much greater detail later on in the video. On the side of our eyepiece, we have the monitor mode button, which allows us to toggle which monitors are active. On the top of the camera, we have the hot shoe flash, and this is where our speed lights will connect with our camera. On the top of the eyepiece for the EVF, which is the electronic viewfinder, there's an automatic sensor which will help save battery power when we bring the camera to our face, and it will shut off the rear monitor. On the EVF, we have the Diopter Adjustment, which allows us to dial in the correct focus for those of us who wear corrective eyewear. On the back of the camera, we have the play button, which will allow us to review our images, and the garbage icon, which will allow us to delete the ones we do not want. The monitor is touch sensitive, and I'll be demonstrating what it can do later in the video, and it can also tilt up and down. To the right of the viewfinder, we have the Photo Video Selector switch, which allows us to tell the camera whether we want to shoot video or stills. Inside of this switch is the Display button, which will allow us to toggle different sets of information on our monitor. The AF On button is customizable and will allow us to use back button focusing if we want. I'll be demonstrating this in the focusing lesson. Below it, we have the joystick, which will aid in moving our focusing squares. The I button will allow us to control different types of critical shooting information on the back monitor. This is the directional pad, which operates similar to the joystick. We can push it up, down, left, or right. Very useful for navigating the menu. Pushing OK acts as the enter button. Below it, we have the deep menu button, and I'll be showing you many important menu items later in the video. Below the menu button, we have the drive modes, which is what the camera does after we push the shutter button down all the way. To the left of these buttons, we have the zoom in and zoom out buttons, which allows us to inspect and navigate our images. Under the right grip, we have our memory card slot, which is designed for an XQD memory card. They are known for their speed and durability. Under the left side of the camera, under two gaskets, we have a number of important ports, including a headphone jack, a microphone jack, HDMI port, USB port. There's an accessory port as well. It's hard to see, but there is a charge light just above the USB port, and you will see it when you are charging in camera. And on the bottom of our camera, we have our battery slot. So that's an overview of the camera's external buttons and ports with an introduction of the names and a short summary of what they do. Now let's get into some of the operations and controls of the camera. So a couple things I want to point out real quick is that when you first turn the camera on, you'll notice that the control panel isn't showing any critical shooting information. And on the back LCD screen, it'll also tell you to unlock the lens. So we have a lens lock designator right here, this little white circle here. The camera will not shoot until you rotate it to a focal length. And at that point, we get some of our exposure settings. So talking about the control panel, this information, we have our shutter speed, aperture, ISO, battery life remaining. This is our drive mode, single shot, and this is the number of shots remaining we have for that particular setting. Something else that I want to note is that typically the manual focus ring is near the front of the lens. The manual focus ring in this case is much closer to the body. It's near the mount. On the side of the EVF, we have the Diopter Adjustment. You're going to have to pull it out to use it and rotate it. Clicky, and then push it in to lock it again. And then we have the monitor control button here, which I'll be toggling and showing you some things. Again, the video, ISO, exposure compensation, mode, the main command dial. So right here we have our autofocus to manual switch. When we switch it over to manual, we can now manually focus. So let's talk about the rear information screen and some of the things that we're going to see on here. The cool thing is that this is mirrored in the EVF with the exception of some of these touch indicators. The information types are pretty much the same. What I'm going to do is make it darker so we can see all these guys. A lot of information back here. Don't get intimidated. Something that you should become used to doing is toggling the display button. We can make different sets of information come and go. Talk about each of these real quick. But starting in the top left-hand corner, we have the mode dial. We have our drive mode, in this case, single frame. We have our focusing mode, which means if the camera is focusing once or many times. We have our focusing cluster. Active D lighting is going to make adjustments to the contrast. Picture controls is essentially the recipe in terms of how the JPEGs are baked. We have our white balance. We have our format indicator, in this case full frame. We have our compression type, normal. We have the size of the image. This is in regards to resolution. The I button allows us to access the I menu. Push that. This is our exposure compensation indicator. It's going to tell us how bright or how dark our images are going to be. In the manual mode, it's more like a metering mode. In the PS and A modes, it is going to help us predict the brightness of our images. This little guy right here with the finger is our touch to take picture. So if we touch on the monitor, it'll focus and take pictures. There's different ways we can toggle this. This is our vibration reduction indicator. Remember, we have IBIS in the camera, so it has the ability to, and it's actually really amazing. It's very high quality IBIS. So we can put other lenses on there through adapters and get image stabilization. Battery life indicator. We have our metering mode. The most important information here are going to be these three guys on the bottom of the screen. Your shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, number of shots remaining. So when we press the display button, you're going to notice some of that information disappeared. Sometimes you're going to be shooting and there's going to be stuff up here that you want to see, right? So you would toggle it away. Push it again, we get our histogram. Push it again, we get our electronic level. Push it again, and we're brought to the information screen, which gives us critical shooting data. So the most important information again, shutter speed, aperture, ISO. We have our mode, manual mode. We have our exposure compensation bracket. It's also going to help with things like bracketing. Basically, this negative means darker, and this positive means brighter. We'll talk about this in depth. Number of shots remaining. And then we get 12 sets of information here on the bottom of the screen. And we can access each of those by pressing the I button. Pulls up the I menu. And we can go through each of these real quick. Picture controls. We're talking about that. It's for JPEGs. Image quality. Flash mode. Wi-Fi connection. We'll be talking about the Wi-Fi in the app. The release mode or the drive modes. It's what the camera does when we push the shutter button down all the way. AF area mode are our focusing squares or focusing clusters. The focusing mode deals with whether the camera is focusing once in a tanning focus lock or if it's a continuous focus. Vibration reduction is turned on in this case. You can come in here, you can see there's a couple other options. Active D-lighting, it's that contrast control we talked about for JPEGs. We have our metering mode, image size, and white balance. While we're here, we might as well talk about each of these real quick. So if we wanted to change any of these items, we could press the OK button. We could also push on the back monitor. Remember, this is a touch screen, gives us lots of controls. The picture controls basically tell the camera what type of processing we want for JPEGs. There's a lot of information that's thrown away between taking the picture, which is capturing the raw data, and then converting it into a JPEG file. It's typically, it could be anywhere as much as like 80% of the information is thrown away. And this is giving instructions to the camera in terms of how to create those JPEGs. Most of the time, for pure beginners, I tell them, if you're just getting started, stick with auto. And then as you get into different types of shooting, you may want to go with a vivid pop for landscapes, or you might want to go with flesh tones for portraits. Again, in the beginning though, I would say, nah, don't worry about it so much. Image quality, if we were to come in here and take a look at all the options we have. So this is telling the camera whether to record a RAW file, a JPEG file, RAW and JPEG file together, or a TIFF file. Again, for pure beginners, people are just getting started, I typically tell them JPEG fine is going to be plenty. If you're shooting something important, pretty good idea to shoot in RAW. RAW is going to capture all of the information. There's different RAW settings we'll talk about. Great for processing. Okay, so white balance, if you want greater dynamic range, better colors, all of this is in RAW. So that's the rule of thumb. If you're shooting casually, yeah, fine, makes sense. If you're doing anything serious, probably a good idea to shoot in RAW. Flash mode basically talks about what kind of flash we're going to be using, whether it's a regular flash, red eye reduction, which is going to fire a pre-flash to dilate the pupils. Rear curtain sync means the flash exposure is going to happen at the end of the exposure, okay, in terms of shutter speed. Typically it happens in the front part of it. And then we have our flash off. We'll be talking about Wi-Fi in depth right now. Let's skip it. Release modes. Let's just talk about each of these real quick. Single frame. We have a low continuous burst, high continuous burst, high plus continuous burst, and then we have our timer. And you'll notice that on the timer, we push down, and we're given different options to control how many seconds that timer will be. We're also given the option to determine the number of shots at the end of that timer. I think it's up to 9 usually. We'll be talking about the AF area mode. in the focusing modes, in the focusing lesson, we come in here real quick. Basically, it gives us different sizes of focusing squares from pinpoint to a single autofocus point, and then we get into these wider areas, and then the auto area usually means it's going to look for the closest subject to you. It has enough contrast for it to pick up. It's beginning focusing mode usually. Focusing mode, single focus. Continuous predictive focus, which is for sport shooting. And we have a manual focus mode. There are some lenses that don't have an autofocus to manual focus switch, and this is how we would turn it to manual focus in those cases. Vibration reduction, we have an incredible IBIS in the camera. You'll notice in here we have a couple different settings. We can turn it off if we need to. So we're shooting on a tripod and we want to eliminate all shake. Normal, which is for handheld, it means the vibration reduction will apply to all the motions, up, down, left, right. And we have a sport mode. Sports shooters typically pan from left to right, and so there's this motion that the camera is trying to plan for. And essentially this mode will eliminate vibration reduction up and down, but not when you're panning. So if you do a lot of sport shooting, that's probably a better one for you. Active D lighting can be great if you shoot a lot of JPEGs and you don't want to do this extra processing. It's a contrast control. Something you're going to want to look at some point. If you're just getting started, yeah, try normal. We have different variations of it. Metering mode we'll be talking about in depth. This has to do with how the camera measures light entering through the lens. Boy, you know, I love the touch screen. I really love it. The good touch monitors will let you do almost everything from the monitor itself. You know, I just don't want to muddy up the screen while we're teaching. We have our JPEGs. I almost always shoot large. You can go from large to small pretty easy. Not so easy to go from small up without losing resolution. And this has to do with the actual size of the files. So we could do the same thing with RAW, large, medium, and small. But again, almost always shooting on large. And then we'll be talking about white balance and depth. The short answer is that if you're shooting in lighting conditions and your white balance looks off, it's going to be a shade of yellow or blue usually. Typically means the camera wants you to set it into the correct white balance setting. Auto for beginners is going to be plenty. So that is the LCD information when you are shooting on stills. If we were to push the toggle switch to go to video, you're going to notice we get a different screen, obviously, and there's a few things in here that are different. A lot of the things are the same. Let's point these guys out real quick. Audio levels. Very important when you're recording video to keep an eye on this. Right now it's in the yellow range. But if we make a loud noise, see we get that red clipping out, that's bad. We do not want that red in there. And there's some controls. Right now I can see it's set for the automatic microphone. I like to have my microphone set to manual. So we actually dial in the specific gain. And this is frequency in terms of the range of noise, the wide indicator. Some of these guys up here, AFF, that's a full-time focus. It's a servo for video. It's like AFC for video. It's constantly focusing over and over again. We have our wide focusing square. Here we have our video resolution settings. It's 1080p. Let me turn down some of these things. Use a much faster shutter speed and get some contrast on there. So 1080p, 60 frames per second, and we can record up to half an hour. So when we press the I button now, you're going to notice that we get different sets of information in here. Just one or two little guys in here. Here's our frame size and rate. We can come in here and change this accordingly. The normal versus high is the quality of the video file. And down here we have the good stuff. This is going to allow us to select different types of resolution. Electronic vibration reduction. The short answer on this is don't use it. Okay, this is a software stabilizer that does it in camera, and it does it by reducing resolution. Basically looks at what part of the frame can not be cropped out, uses that to steady motion it predicts and stuff. Short answer on this is you can do it in post if it's important. Otherwise, it's kind of degrading the video. And that's why I don't use it. Again, AFF, it's a little bit different here. Pretty much the same concepts. Then we have our microphone sensitivity. This is something I would recommend changing in the menu to manual. So this control is a little counterintuitive. Right now it's turned to A for automatic. Just push to the right. That will turn the microphone off. And if you continue to push to the right, now we have our manual gain controls. So it gives us a number instead of a letter. And then we can dial in the gain specifically. Very important if you're recording video to have good audio. Audio is really, really critical. So I'm just going to leave it there because I like that setting. Hit OK. And the white balance, the picture controls, all those things, these are going to apply to video now. The video that we're recording on the Z6 and the Z7, it is a form of JPEG. So we are baking 24 or 30 frames or 60 frames per second in these little JPEG files. And so this allows us to dial it in. We're talking a little bit more about that. The short answer is try to get it right as you're recording. So that is the information screens. One little shortcut I can give you guys is that when you go through the eye menu, you can use a directional pad just to highlight it, and then you can rotate the main command wheel. So you don't have to go into the sub menu to access it. If it'll save you a step over the period of time that can add up. Just a little tip. So let's talk about exposure control, which is really a fancy way of saying changing your image brightness. And I would recommend getting your camera and having it in hand as you watch this and do some of these exercises with me. The short answer is we have a mode dial up here on the top left hand of the camera. It has the letters P, A, S, and M. We also have these U1, U2, U3, and a little green icon with a camera. The green icon with the camera is lovingly referred to in my world as the dummy mode. And you bought this really amazing, nice camera. It's beautiful, and the things that it can do are amazing. This is turning it into a point and shoot. Camera's going to be making most of the decisions for you. All you have to do is point it in the direction of what you're shooting and push the shutter button down and take a picture. It's not going to let you change most of the other settings. It's going to allow you to change some things like your ISO, for example, and you're still going to get the benefit of a very large sensor, but we cannot change the shutter speed or the aperture. Another thing I need to point out, it's going to be hard to rotate this if you do not push that little post into the camera body. It's an auto lock, and basically push it down to rotate. P mode, program mode, is going to pretty much take the training wheels off, so to speak. It's going to allow you to change some of the camera settings. You notice that when we rotate the command wheel, we get some shutter speed and aperture changes. We'll talk about that in a second. But what I would recommend is that if you are a pure beginner, start off as soon as you can on aperture priority mode, the A mode. The reason is, as you progress and as you get better, you're going to be shooting on aperture priority mode a lot. Okay, so I shoot on it probably 60 to 70% of the time. Anytime I'm outdoors, sports shooting, events, things of that nature. If I have time, if I'm indoors, if I'm shooting strobes, if I have time, then I'm on manual, M mode. But I'm going to give you a lot of information here about controlling your exposure. So you can see right now our ISO is pretty low, and we're going to want to turn that up a little bit for the sake of this lesson. You'll also notice that we get certain sets of information with a highlighted box. What that refers to is this is accessible by touch. So we can come in here. We have a small adjustment and we have larger adjustments. I think that's really nice. I think that's great. I love the touch screen, by the way. And we can do the same for the aperture. And in the aperture priority mode, you'll notice that the shutter speed is turned off. So there's a short answer to this, and there's a long answer to this. The short answer is that when you take a picture in P, S, or A modes, and you play it back and you're not happy with it, we can make it brighter by using something called the exposure compensation button. It's just behind and to the right of the power switch. So my finger is going to come up here. I'm pushing and holding it down, and then we get this yellow box down here. You'll notice the yellow box has a split through it, horizontal, and on the top left side, there is a positive, a plus sign, and on the bottom right, there's a minus sign. So I'm going to push and hold the exposure compensation button down, and I'm going to rotate to the right, and you notice the image preview is getting brighter. And so if I was to take another picture and play those back, I could compare the bright picture with the one before it, and you can see the exposure or the brightness is increased. That's the short answer. Very powerful. You're going to be able to get away with a lot just doing this. If you want to go brighter, now we're at 2. We can keep on going all the way to 5. So if we go in the other direction, now we're getting negative numbers, -2. So that is how you can control exposure in the PS or A modes. Now there are some problems with this, because as we change our image brightness, we're also changing our shutter speed over here. So if you're using aperture priority control, sneak a peek at your shutter speed to make sure it's going to be fast enough. So if you're shooting portraits, for example, you're going to be at least 1/60th of a second. In some cases, maybe 1/100th or 1/125th of a second. If you're shooting sports, it'll have to be much faster, 1/500th of a second, 1/1000th of a second. So I'm constantly in the habit of sneaking a peek at my shutter speed when I am shooting in aperture priority mode. So that is the short answer, and now I'm going to give you a longer answer. I want you to take your hand and put it in front of the lens. Don't touch it. You don't need to touch it and get dirty. But just kind of block out some light, and you're going to notice that the shutter speed is changing. Okay? What this means is that the camera in aperture priority mode is making adjustments to the shutter speed. We're essentially telling the camera, hey, we want f4. And the camera is saying, okay, well, I'll just change the shutter speed depending on how much light's coming into the camera, and it'll give you an even exposure. Okay, so that's the heart of the matter with aperture priority mode. We select the aperture, the camera selects the shutter speed. So talking about this a little bit deeper, when we talk about exposure compensation, and we're rotating this dial to +1, what does that +1 mean? That refers to one stop of light, which is, a stop is twice the amount of light as it was before. And we can prove this with math. 1/100th of a second, that was our even exposure. There's a third. There's 2/3. Now there's one full stop. Okay? Look what happened to the shutter speed. 1/50th of a second. So if we were to take 1/100th and double it, it would be 1/100th plus 1/100th, which is 2/100ths. That's 1/50th of a second. So the question I have for you is, what if we go for one more stop? What would the shutter speed be? Think about it. It's going to be twice as long as 1/50th. 1/50th plus 1/50th is 1/25th. There it is. So with the shutter speed, we're letting in twice the amount of light, and we can keep on going. Think about it. What would it be? Twice the length of 1/25th of a second, 1/13th of a second, and so on and so forth. And that continues to go. And again, if we were to take our hand and put it in front of the lens, the shutter speed would also still change. So the camera would respect exposure compensation in the P, S, and A modes. Let's go in the other direction. 1/100th of a second. Let's go to -1 stop. 1/200th of a second. What do you think -2 would be? 1/400th. It's deciding between 400 and 500. Keep going. 1/800th. So that is the heart of the matter with exposure compensation and allowing the camera to make the adjustments in the aperture priority mode. It's going to be the shutter speed. So let's say we're in a situation such as indoor sports shooting and our shutter speed isn't fast enough. What are we going to do? The lens is opened as wide as it'll go. We need that shutter speed to be faster. If you said adjust the ISO, you're absolutely correct. You'll notice that as we turn our ISO up, we can use faster shutter speeds. Keep on going. And the ISO performance is actually pretty good. on the Z7, as far as I'm seeing, you could probably turn it up quite a bit. It's going to depend on the subject matter you're shooting, so just do some test shots. But now I'm at ISO 6400, have a very fast shutter speed. When you get the camera, I should probably point this out, it may be on auto ISO, which I'm not a huge fan of. To turn off auto ISO, come into your menu, deep menu. We're going to go green tab, ISO settings, and I've turned off my ISO sensitivity. This is what it looks like when it's on. It gives you some ranges in terms of your maximum ISO for with and without a flash, and then we have a minimum shutter speed, which is going to set a limit in terms of the slowest shutter speed that you can use when you're using auto ISO. The only time I use auto ISO is when I'm shooting indoor sports and I need a specific shutter speed in a specific aperture and there's changing lighting conditions, then I will use auto ISO. So I have mixed feelings about recommending this to pure beginners. In some cases it makes sense, but I really think you should tackle the controls of exposure when we're talking about shutter speed, aperture, and then ISO. So with my students, I typically tell them to turn it off and get used to changing it when you need to, but if it's too much, you can turn it back on. So let's take a look at this in shutter priority mode. Did you guys notice what changed there? The box went from the aperture down here to shutter speed. In this mode, we dial in the shutter speed that we want, and the camera makes adjustments to the aperture. We take our hand, move it in front of the lens. Now the aperture is changing. If we were using a lower ISO, camera's not happy. When you see that flashing indicator, that means the camera is telling you there's not enough light in this situation. The aperture will not open wide enough. And this is solved if you're shooting sports and you need that shutter speed, for example. You can come in here and just bump the ISO up. There it goes, and disappears. So if we wanted to use exposure compensation, again, we push and hold that button down, rotate our command wheel, and you can see the camera is making adjustments now to the aperture. Go the other way. And if you get in a situation where it flashes like that, just bump your ISO up and you'll be good to go. So let's talk about program mode, the P mode. You'll notice that we lose the highlight on both of them. Exposure compensation is respected between modes. Did you guys notice this? So I'm at plus 1/3. If I go into aperture priority mode, there it is. Or shutter priority, aperture priority. So between modes, it's respected. It's remembered. Program mode essentially allows us to change some of the settings as I rotate the main command wheel. You'll notice both the shutter speed and aperture are changing. It's giving us different combos that will give us an even exposure. There are some pros that I know of that use program mode with flash, and that's just how they roll, so whatever it takes to get the job done. I personally don't use program mode that much, but if you're just getting started and you're feeling intimidated, it could be a good place to start. There's no shame in that. Let's talk about manual mode. Now you'll notice that all three have this black box around it, which means that we can change the shutter speed, the aperture, the ISO. The camera is not going to be making any changes without your permission to those three settings. In the manual mode, the exposure compensation bar on the right is not the exposure compensation bar, it's the light meter. It's just measuring how much light's coming into the camera. If you take your hand and put it in front, you see how it's getting darker and it's flashing, saying, hey, this is way underexposed, right? So the question is, what in the world is happening when we push the exposure compensation button down and go up to +1? In the manual mode, you'll notice nothing is happening in terms of exposure. It's not getting brighter or darker, nothing's happening. However, if we were to take that setting, +1 now, and flip it over to the aperture priority mode, you can see that it's respected. That's what's happening. So keep that in mind. This is a light meter in manual. So I know that's a lot of information we just covered. We covered the modes, which ones you should be using, how to change your exposure settings in those modes. And we also talked about exposure compensation, raising and lowering the brightness of our images in each of those three modes. So the way the custom modes work on the dial is we have a U1, U2, and U3. Those are custom modes, which means that we can dial in specific settings that we like. Let's say you have a sports shooting mode where you have a picture control, you like your aperture priority, you like maybe raw, you have all these settings just dialed in for sports shooting, and you don't want to have to redial that in every time you go shoot sports. So the way this works is you're going to come in to your orange tab. Oh, and something that's cool about this is you can just touch and scroll. I think that's way better. Save user setting. So once you have your camera all dialed in, come to your yellow tab. It's the first page. You can tell the page number by how high the slider is on the right. Save user settings, save it to position 1, 2, or 3. And then the next time you just flip it over to that mode and you're ready to go. It's a great little shortcut. If you want to reset them, you can come in here and reset those as well. Let me make a couple notes for you guys in the movie mode. Very different. In the movie mode, the short answer is your shutter speed should be twice your frame rate. So if we're shooting at 60 frames per second, we want this to be around, I don't know, 125, 125th of a second. That has to do with something called the 180-degree shutter rule to get a film-like look. So if you're shooting at 30 frames, you want it to be about 60. Typically for film shooting, video shooting, I set my shutter speed first, then the aperture I want, and I adjust with my ISO. Another critical note is video shooting is make sure you get your white balance set correctly. Okay, so if you're in mixed lighting conditions, it's going to be really important to make this look good because you don't have a lot of data in the video file unless you're recording to an external recorder, 10-bit 422. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the video section. If you're shooting at that 8-bit 420, try to get it right in camera. So that is exposure tips for shooting in video. Real quick, let's talk about white balance. The short answer on this is if you're a pure beginner, auto white balance is probably a pretty good place to start. What's going to happen though is that you're going to be shooting and eventually your pictures are going to look blue or yellowish. And what's happening is the camera is having a hard time distinguishing what type of light source we are shooting in. Our eyes are great at adjusting to different light sources. Camera sensors, not so much. And in those cases, you would need to come in and dial the specific white balance setting. So again, auto white balance, anytime you see this little arrow pointing down, we can come in and we can make some adjustments to it. So there's kind of a more white to lower warm colors, and there's going to be keeping the warm colors, and there's a balance, and then we can tweak this further by pushing down, and then we get our white balance customization, blue, green, amber, magenta, and we can come in here and actually tweak the hue of the white balance. I don't recommend this for beginners, but in recent years, I've started using it more in certain situations. Auto white balance is going to be pretty good most of the time. We have a natural light auto, so if you're shooting outdoors, again, there's the tweaks. Then we have direct sunlight, cloud cover, shade, incandescent light, which is light bulbs, fluorescent light, flash, strobe. Kelvin white balance is very handy. I use it quite a bit. We can come in and actually choose the Kelvin temperature. I'll talk about that in just a second. And we have our preset manuals. The preset manual allows us to essentially measure the whiteness of the situation we're in. I used it a lot when I was shooting weddings, mixed lighting. Hey, the colors are kind of funky. I'd use a bride's dress sometime. So anything white in the situation you're shooting. So let's measure this. And hit OK. It's basically taking a picture and then data acquired. And now this is in the preset manual. It's supposed to be white. And there we go. So that is how you set your custom white balance. But if you want to talk about this scale and a little bit of theory behind it, people always freak out when I do this. They say it's too much or whatever. The longer answer is that these wavelengths of light, okay, the whiteness in these conditions changes. And it's something referred to as the Kelvin scale. Here, to summarize this, lower Kelvin temperatures are going to have a yellow color to them. Higher Kelvin temperatures are going to be more blue. So the scale can range anywhere from 1000 Kelvin to 10,000 Kelvin, okay? Daylight is about 5600 Kelvin. It's kind of like in between. It's pretty much the widest type of light. So if candlelight is very, very yellow, and we're shooting in a yellow environment, let's just take a look at this. And I'm turning this down, and you can see it's getting very blue. You're like, Michael, what are you talking about? Look how blue it is. You know, this is blue light. What's happening is the camera is going to do the opposite of the light that you're shooting in. So if you're shooting in very yellow light, the camera is going to make a blue adjustment to balance it out. So let's say we're shooting in higher Kelvin temperature lights. For example, after the sun goes down, okay, twilight time. That's a very high Kelvin temperature blue. The camera is going to balance it out with a yellow, okay, a yellow color and hue. So the confusion comes in is when people start referring to the look of the image as hot or cold, okay? So blue look is referred to as cooler, and a yellow look is referred to as hotter. But really what's happening is those are the opposite with the Kelvin scale. The lower temperatures are yellow and the higher temperatures are more blue. So let's talk about the focusing of a camera. It's very complex. We have a touch monitor that's going to aid us quite a bit. There's different ways we can focus. There's different modes, there's different clusters, and this can be very overwhelming for pure beginners. The way I break it down is the how, the when, and the where. If you can think of those three things, it's going to be cake. Now, traditional cameras, most of them, how do we focus is with a halfway shutter button depression. So I'm going to push the shutter button halfway down. Camera gets focusing. We can see it with the green square. Push it down all the way to take the picture. And that's how you focus. So let's talk about the when. Come into your I menu, bottom right-hand corner, we have this menu item called Focusing Modes. When we select this, we get three options. AFS stands for Auto Focus Single. And what this means is that when we push the shutter button halfway down, we get a focus lock, and as long as we keep the shutter button halfway depressed, it stays focus locked. So we can actually move the camera and the focal plane will not change. Focus over here, same thing. Okay, so very useful for recomposing. It's when we get a focus lock and we move the camera to be more aesthetically pleasing. More important on DSLRs than mirrorless cameras that have really good coverage, because now we can just touch on the monitor and focus there. Continuous autofocus means that the camera is going to be focusing over and over and over again when we push the shutter button halfway down. You notice the focusing is changing from the blinds to the target. And it's not giving us that green square, right? So that is the predictive nature of autofocus continuous. It's repetitive. And then we're ready to take the picture, push the shutter button down all the way. Manual focus is exactly what it sounds like. It allows us to use our manual focusing ring and dial it in manually. You'll notice we get this little, almost like a rangefinder. We have closer, which is designated with a flower, and further away, which is designated as an infinity symbol. So that is the when, whether it's a single focus, a repetitive focus, or manual focus. So let's talk about the where. This has to do with the camera's focusing squares, or clusters I refer to them. I have a very small focusing square right now, and I'm abusing the back monitor, which I'll show you in a second. Traditionally, we would come in and select the cluster size. We have a single Pinpoint AF. So we can see that. Look how small that guy is. Teeny, teeny, tiny. If you want super precise focusing, you can use that. You can move it around with a joystick or the directional pad. Pushing OK will reset it to the center. The problem with this is using the joysticks is it takes so long to get to the other side. So we have this amazing touch monitor. I'm going to talk about that in just a second. Let's talk about some of these other points. We got single point. This is the one we started with. You can see it there. And then we get into the wider areas. That's about something I would use for sport shooting. Maybe even the next bigger one. It's a slightly larger area. A little bit bigger. See that? This size focusing cluster is much easier with the joysticks if it was up to your face and you were changing, your focusing position, for example. Then we have the auto area, auto focus. This is going to, see the brackets? Choose the closest thing to you and say, this is what I'm focusing on. Pretty straightforward. Something I'll demonstrate in just a second is that there is a face detection mode that we can use with the auto area. It's basically telling the camera to look in this area for someone's face. I kind of like, when I'm shooting portraits, to be very specific to focus on the eye. That's just me. And so I don't really use face detection as much, but I will show you how to set that up. Something I need to point out real quick is that there is a hidden focusing cluster that you're not going to see if you're on autofocus single. It gives us these 5 standard single point AF, right? So if we come in and we go to autofocus continuous, we are going to get access to something called the dynamic area AF. So if we come out and take a look at this, you can see that we have this different cluster. There's a central position, which is the primary area of focus, but we have these 8 dots around the box. This is giving the camera permission to look in the surrounding area. So really great for sports shooting. I have my target up there on the blinds. It's not exactly focused in, but I touch the shutter button halfway down. And so it's going to use that area for additional focusing. So that is the dynamic AF cluster. So that is the how, the when, and the where. Now let's talk about the touch monitor with focusing. We have an amazing touch monitor. Absolutely crazy awesome. Something I need to point out is that we have touch monitor settings. So I just turned it off. Nothing's happening. I'm touching on the monitor. If this happens to you, this is probably turned off, right? There's 3 settings in here. As we toggle through these, touch shutter, autofocus on. Okay, so that means that after it focuses, it's going to actually take a picture. That drives me crazy, but some people love it. I like touch autofocus on, which means it's just going to focus on the area. It's not going to do anything else. And then we can turn it off. Nothing's happening. For the most part, I'm right here. So let's talk about back button focusing. Back button focusing allows us to use the AF on button to get focusing lock. And to set this up correctly, we're going to have to remove focusing from the halfway shutter button depression. So take, for example, if this was an athlete running that has stopped and I get focus and I want to change the composition just a little bit, maybe center the shot. If you're using a halfway shutter button depression here, this is a real problem. Why? Because when we push the shutter button halfway down, now it's focusing somewhere else. With back button focusing, we can get focus lock, lift the thumb up, shoot no matter where the square is, and it's going to be in focus. It's a really nice way to shoot sports. So how do we set this up? We're going to come into the menu. We're going to go to autofocus A7, which is autofocus activation. If this is turned on, what this means is both the AF on button and the halfway shutter button depression are going to give you focusing lock. If we go to AF on only, that removes the halfway shutter button depression. So when we come over here, let's get focus on here. Thumb, there it is, release. Let's come back over here, halfway shutter button depression, nothing happens. So that's how you set up back button focusing. To turn it back on, we'd come in and come here. For pure beginners, I say start with the halfway shutter button depression for now, and if you get into sport shooting, customize it. So let's talk about face detection real quick. Come into your custom settings. A4 is auto face detection when we're using auto area. So here's a picture of me, I don't have face detection this time. I'm zooming in, nothing's happening. Okay, we can use our focusing square if we had to. It's because we're not using the auto area mode. There it is. And so now we get the face. And so if I'm rotating to the left and right, you can see that it's pretty much tracking on the face here. We can get it okay to get our tracking mode. The tracking mode, I have mixed feelings about because it doesn't always work very well. The idea is that you can put it over a target, hit OK, and now it's going to track a moving subject as we go to the left and right. So even on a clean white background, it's doing okay, not great. The idea is if you are shooting video, this is how it's supposed to work, is that you would have this continuous focus and it would automatically focus on the subject for you, you know, but the truth of the matter is it just doesn't work that great in my experience. So I don't use tracking. I rarely use the face detection. So let's come back out. We can exit this by pushing the minus icon, but those are some tools there that you have at your disposal. If you're shooting, you know, f4, f5.6, face detection can be great. Let's turn the exposure down a little bit here. It looks a little bright. Autofocus single. There's the face. Push the shutter button halfway down, and then we get our green box, which is telling us it's in focus. So that's face detection in tracking. Let me show you a couple tools that are very useful, especially if we're in something like video mode. Okay, so come over to video mode. So let's check our focusing modes. AFF, let's come in here. And the question you're going to have is what's the difference between autofocus continuous and AFF? They work essentially the same. Autofocus continuous means that we have to push the shutter button halfway down to get this repetitive focus. AFF means is that the camera is constantly going to be focusing when the composition or the subject matter changes. So it's going to engage it without the halfway shutter button depression. I am not a huge fan of AFF simply because it does some things unpredictably. Is you'll be shooting and all of a sudden you'll get this shift. So when you're shooting high-end video, a lot of this is done manually. There's an actual person whose job it's the first AC, first assistant camera. His job is to focus the camera. Because we're shooting with some great technology, we can change the focus by touching on the screen ourselves. So AFF, not a huge fan of it. Autofocus single, I am a huge fan of this for video because once we tap on the monitor, it gets focus and then it doesn't change, it doesn't do anything. And we can change again the size of our focusing clusters if we wanted a smaller area. So this is very useful. It's very powerful to pull focus, meaning we're changing the focus as we're shooting video. So if we were to actually turn this on, and we're recording video, we can have, you know, an actor or an actress speaking here and they turn around and they look at their car and now they're looking at their car. And that is how pulling focus is used in the movies, is to direct attention. Somebody at the car yells at them and they say something back. Very powerful. In the past, you would have to get this whole rig and put it on the lenses and have to, you know, practice and get it right. This is far easier. We can also adjust some of these settings, which I'll demonstrate when we go through the custom menus. Let me show you a couple other cool tools here. Let's come back to stills shooting. We're still in this face detection wide area. Let's go to this. This technique I refer to as manual zoom focusing. Simply put the focusing square over your desired subject. See this magnifying glass plus? You can push that in. And now we're zoomed in on the target. We can use our manual focus if we want to dial that in specifically. See the sharpness of those edges, and then we can take the picture from there. That's manual zoom focusing. Very handy technique. Let me show you something else. Come into the menu. We're going to go to Shooting and Display. We're looking for D10. Peaking is an overlay in the viewfinder. It's typically a color. Let's turn it on to high. And we can choose the color we want. I like red because red typically stands out, but there's blue, yellow, and white. So right now we don't see anything, right? Let's flip our lens switch to manual. There it is. So peaking only works in the manual focusing mode. We can zoom in. There it is. You can see it's kind of hard to see, but it's there. See that red overlay? That is telling us it is in focus. That'll work with or without the zoom mode. Zoom back out. If we were to focus on the face, you can see there's the highlight. That is peaking. It'll work for both stills and video mode. There it is. Very, very useful. I love it. I use it all the time. So let's talk about our release modes real quick. Bottom right-hand corner of our camera, just below the menu button, we have this multi-frame image. These are the release modes. This is what the camera does after we push the shutter button down all the way. Push that. S is a single frame, right? And then we get into our continuous modes where we see multiple frames and we see something there on the top pop up, these different numbers. This refers to frames per second. So in our low continuous burst, we can select from 1 to 5. Then we have our high continuous, which is 5.5 frames per second. And then we have the full 9 frames per second burst. Coming further, we have our timer, and we can adjust using the front command wheel, whether it's 2, 5, 10 seconds, 20 seconds. So those are the release modes. Very quick and fast way to change it using those dials. Let me show you this EVF feature here. This little black box above the viewfinder is essentially a power saver. So when we bring the camera to our face, it recognizes this and it turns it off. This can be a huge problem when you're shooting on a gimbal, for example. Okay, for video, the gimbal would actually be right here and you wouldn't be able to see what you're shooting. So the way we can control this is by pushing the monitor mode button on the left side of the viewfinder. I'm pushing it and we're toggling and getting different types of monitor views. So the automatic display switch was the one I just showed you. Then we have the viewfinder only. Then we have the monitor only. And then we get something called prioritize viewfinder. And I think this is an actual glitch on the Z7. Maybe a firmware update will correct it. The idea of this is that it turns your viewfinder into what you'd be used to for a DSLR camera. However, in the movie mode, it's pretty much similar to the automatic switch. Okay, if you're looking in here, turns off the monitor. It's really made for the photo mode, and you will be in the priority monitor mode, EVF mode, if you switch from movie to stills after setting it up. So right now, both monitors are off, but if you look into the viewfinder, the monitor will turn on. The glitch with this is that you cannot select the priority mode from a still shooting mode. It's not there. And in reading in the manual and stuff, it appears to be maybe a firmware thing. So if the only way you can get that is by starting off in the movie mode and then flipping over. I really don't use it anyway. I usually use the automatic, or I turn this off and use the monitor only when shooting on a gimbal. So let's talk about playback and some of the touchscreen options. So when we're playing images back, we can touch and drag to go through our images. We can pinch our fingers out to zoom in. We can pinch them together to zoom out. If we keep on going, we get the grid display of what we've seen. We can zoom in. A lot of this is very intuitive if you have a smartphone, for example. When we push up on our display, there's some options I'm going to show you in the menu that will give you more shooting information. You can see we have a resolution, or the date, the time, bunch of other stuff we can see if we want. So let's start talking about the deep menu system, which can be accessed by pressing the menu button right here in the bottom right corner. A few things that I want to point out is, first of all, get used to using the touch screen, which you can touch and drag. very useful, very fast. And you're going to notice that as I'm in a specific tab, as long as I'm dragging, I stay in that tab. So to change tabs, we can press on the tab itself and then touch and drag in the page. The thing that I like about this is that when you touch an item, it automatically takes you in to that feature. In the past, we had to navigate using something like the directional pad. The joystick's going to take you out to the shooting mode. So you can't really navigate with the joystick, navigate with the directional pad if there's a reason you don't want to touch the screen. The problem with this is there's multiple button presses. So once you highlight something, you have to push OK or to the right to open it. The second part of this is there is definitely a hierarchy of controls when we're talking about the camera. So come back out to the shooting mode. We have dedicated buttons for the most important things, and I made a video of this on YouTube about how well I thought Nikon did for its first version of its full-frame mirrorless. For example, if I wanted to change my ISO, I could push and hold my ISO down and then rotate my rear control wheel. That's a very fast, easy change to make. Now there are a lot of redundant controls, so I can press the menu button and come into ISO sensitivity settings, and I can push right, and I can select it, and I can also change my ISO sensitivity this way. The problem with it is it took 5 extra steps. So this is a waste of time, and there's a lot of controls that have setups in the menu. It's just not nearly as fast as learning the controls when you're shooting. So the hierarchy is, if there is a dedicated button for it, use the button first. The second idea is the I menu. So if there's not a dedicated button, set this up, and I'll show you how to do this, in such a way that it's in the I menu for things that you use not quite as much, but often enough you don't want to go into the deep menu. And if there's an important setting that you cannot access, like a customization, things of that nature, save those kinds of things for the deep menu. So as we go through these guys, I'm going to be pointing out many redundant controls that can be accessed in different places, and you're going to save yourself a lot of time shooting in that way. So real quick, the FN1 button, my default setup is for white balance. So I can push that front FN1 button, and I'm changing my white balance here. My focusing modes, I'm pushing the FN2 button. So I can change my focusing modes using the rear control wheel, and my focusing clusters using the front control wheel. That is a habit that you want to get in because it's very fast, very quick. So let's come into the deep menu, and let me point out some of my suggested settings. This is something I need to do a better job of, is saying this is what I use, this is why. And the other thing I need to point out is that on the crash course, we have tons of dedicated lessons to some of these specific techniques. For example, auto bracketing. There's a lesson there where we go into a business for an interior shot, and I show you a real-world situation in terms of how to use it and actually make money on that shoot. Interval timer shooting. We have a lesson where we go down to the beach and I'm showing you how to shoot sunsets using interval timing. The focus shift or focus stacking lesson. We show you how to use this feature. And those lessons are in far more depth than what I can cover here. You know, I'm just kind of covering the important things and kind of what I do, but I will point out my suggested settings. Something you're going to notice is that each tab has its own color, and that color is also in this thin line here. So blue is for playback, and you can see this little color line here. And so as we scroll through these, which I'm using the pad so you don't have to see my fat thumb in the picture, green is for photo shooting, stills. This lighter green is for movie shooting. We have our custom setting menus. This is almost this reddish. And then our orange is the setup menu. Then the purple is our retouch menu. And the gray is the custom menu. It's called My Menu. And there's also recent settings. I'll demonstrate those in a second. Many things in the playback menu are pretty straightforward. For example, you know, you're never going to use the delete from the deep menu because you have a dedicated button for it right here. We can choose our playback folder, whether it's a single folder or all of them. Playback display options is kind of useful. It allows us to determine what info we can get access to when we're playing back our images. Wants you to push to the right. I keep on doing that. Hit OK. Wants you to push to the right and then hit OK. So when we're playing an image back, if you push up, this is from this focus stacking lesson. If you push up, we get different sets of information that can be displayed. And so that's what that option does. It allows us to control what sets of information we can toggle through. So image review, as we're shooting, do you want to see the image? And the difference between on means it's going to play back both in the viewfinder and the back monitor. On only is this going to be the back monitor, not the EVF. And so that's pretty good customization for sport shooters. Let's come into rotate tall. I recommend turning on. This is going to rotate the image from portrait orientation. So when we're shooting portrait, we come back to view horizontally, it'll rotate it. The slideshow allows us to plug an HDMI cable into the camera and play it back on a monitor. Haven't used it for a while since my wedding shooting days. And we have the rating feature, which allows us to assign stars 1 through 5 by pushing up or down on the directional pad. We can touch drag through the images, select the image we want, push up or down, and those image ratings are respected on Lightroom or Camera Raw when you import them. So if you know you got something good, might be worth rating. So that's a blue tab. I know I kind of went through it quickly. These other things are pretty self-explanatory. Let's talk about the photo shooting menu. And something you'll notice on both the photo and the video shooting menu is that you can reset just this menu. So if you come in here and you tweak a bunch of things and you're not happy with it, you can come in and reset. I lent a camera to a friend once and he jacked everything up and I just come in and reset it. Don't loan your cameras to your friends. I don't do that anymore. They don't treat them the same. They don't take care of the gear the same way you do. So storage folder, this is where you are writing to. Where do you want images saved? So you can rename the folder. You can select the different folders that you have. You can select the folder from the list. So here they are. These are the ones that I have. Come back out. When you create a new folder number, like this is going to create a new folder. Keep that in mind. We can change the 3 letters in front of the files. Right now it's DSC. That's standard for Nikon cameras. And that will change depending on whether or not we're shooting in sRGB or Adobe RGB. Image area, for the most part on the Z7 and the Z6 for stills, I recommend leaving this on FX, the full frame 35mm sensor size. For video, it's different, so I'll be making those recommendations when we get to that tab. Image quality has to do with how the files are written to the memory card, and this can be accessed in the I menu. So if we come out, here it is, quality, come in here, and you can select this way. I think this even makes more sense, selecting it. So raw files, obviously, it's all of the information. And then the JPEG, fine, normal, basic, all of those refer to different compressions in terms of how compressed the JPEG file is. The trade-off on this is smaller file size, and the truth of the matter is it's very difficult to see the difference between something like fine star and fine normal versus normal star. Even between fine and normal, it's very difficult to see any differences, and you might get half the file size. The reason I go through this trouble to tell you is that if you are shooting an event where you may have to shoot 5,000 images, like a wedding or something, it's pretty hard to do that in RAW for workflow reasons. Those are pretty big files, especially on the Z7. And so there are times you should definitely be shooting JPEG, sports shooting, event shooting, anything with lots and lots of images. If you're shooting something important that is going into a magazine, or you're going to be editing, or if it's mixed lighting, things of that nature, landscape, it makes more sense to shoot raw. And sometimes I shoot both, where I want the raw images, but I might, have JPEGs to skim through just because they're faster to upload to the computer, and I might only take a couple raws anyway. So I use these as tools. There's no one set way to do this. Image size, I recommend shooting in large for everything. For JPEGs as well as RAW, here it is. Why? Because we can always downsize. It's easy to downsize an image. You can't take a small image and upsize it very easily. But if you're only shooting for like the internet, and that's all you do is eBay stuff, or something where you just don't need the large file sizes, you could shoot in small, and the camera will record it in a smaller file size. So for our raw recording, almost always recommend 14-bit lossless compressed. Lossless compressed means that you're going to get a raw file that has a little bit less file space. Okay, so the idea is that it's not throwing away valuable information, but it's throwing away something to get the smaller file size. Compressed means that you are going to lose some important information, and uncompressed is the original 100% raw file. I can't see a difference. I've done some tests between lossless compressed and uncompressed. I'm not seeing any weird artifacts or anything like that, which I have in the past on other cameras. And for that reason, I'm almost always shooting on lossless compressed 14-bit. 12-bit, obviously not as much color information, but again, I go for 14-bit. ISO sensitivity settings, we can change with a dedicated button, as with white balance. Picture control is something that we can at least change our setting in the I button. So right here, there's our picture controls. And we can even adjust them in the same way by pushing down. And we have all these settings that we can adjust. And I like this. I like doing it out here more because it gives you a preview. So when we're talking about picture controls in the deep menu, we can come in and we can adjust these settings, but we don't get a preview. That's why I'm not a huge fan of doing it here. And I also need to point out, this is mainly for JPEG images. It does not affect RAW images. It'll affect the preview on your back monitor, and it'll affect the JPEGs that you import, but this does not touch RAW files. Okay, so if you are shooting video, this is a little bit more important because video is a form of JPEG. RAW files, not quite as important because all that information is saved. But if you're shooting JPEGs, then this becomes important. I typically tell beginners to shoot on the auto picture control to start. If you are not liking, let's say, your flesh tones, you may want to come down to portrait. Or if you're shooting mostly landscape, you might want to try landscape. And if we come over further to the right, we have the ability to tweak these settings a little bit more. So if we're talking about sharpness, we can adjust them individually. So this is a quick sharp, it changes all three of them. Clarity, mid-range sharpening, we have contrast controls, brightness, saturation. And so I would recommend not worrying about this in the beginning. If you become a very advanced or professional shooter and there are reasons you want to tweak this, such as video files, that would be the time to do it. So managing our picture controls means we can create our own custom picture controls. And this is where you do it. You'd come in here and you'd select something to start, you would tweak the settings, and you would hit OK, and that would save it. We could rename that picture control, we can delete it, we could also save it to a memory card and transfer it over to another camera. If you come in here and copy to a camera or delete from a card. Very powerful, good stuff. It's not letting me choose that. Color space, obviously sRGB for most of us. If you are shooting for a magazine, you'd go Adobe RGB. Active D lighting, I typically have it turned off. And this is something that is going to add a slight contrast bump to JPEGs. Long exposure noise reduction, I typically have it turned off. Again, this applies to JPEGs only, does not apply to RAW. High ISO noise reduction, I typically have mine to normal. And what this is going to do is help reduce some of the noise in your images when you're shooting in higher ISOs. Vignette control has to do with certain lenses, especially wide-angle lenses where we get darkening in corners, and I have mine set to normal. This again is a JPEG thing, very important for video shooting. And so what's happening is Nikon is putting profiles into lenses that tells the camera body, hey, clean this up as you're recording. And so what happens is when you adapt a lens over that is not a Nikon lens, it doesn't have that information, the vignetting is far more apparent. That's a very subtle difference between using Nikon lenses and other lenses that you're adapting over. Same thing with the diffraction compensation is if there's information in the lens, you can turn this on to limit how much diffraction is happening. Same thing with the bowing effect or the pincushion effect for wide angle lenses. I'm using the 24-70 here and it doesn't have that information, so it doesn't recognize it. Flicker reduction shooting has to do with sodium and vapor lamps that give off different colors. This allows the camera to recognize the lull between those pulses that we cannot see with the human eye, and it allows us to shoot consistently with that color in the exposure. Metering we covered in the metering lesson, and then in the flash control stuff, we talk about all this stuff in the full crash course. There's a lesson there on speed lights. We talk about studio strobes. And most of the controls I recommend making from the flash unit itself, not so much back here because it's easier to do it from the flash unit. Focusing modes we've covered, that's the when. The area modes, those are the clusters, we've also talked about those. Vibration reduction we can change from the I menu. Auto bracketing means that we're giving the camera permission to change certain kinds of information between each shot. And the way we set this up is we come in here, it says auto bracketing set. This is where we determine what information is being changed. AE is auto exposure. So ambient light and reflected light bracketing. If you're using the flash, it's going to do both. If you don't have a flash, it's just ambient light exposure only. Then we have flash bracketing only, white balance only, and then active D lighting bracketing. The ones you're going to use the most are auto exposure bracketing, and I can see some white balance bracketing if you were in a weird situation, but almost always auto exposure bracketing. Something else I've noticed is like this out button sometimes doesn't work. So once you've selected the type of bracketing that you want, you're going to come down and choose how many shots you want. It's typically 3. We can go 5, 7, 9 if we wanted to. It's probably too many. And then we select how much exposure difference do we want between each of those shots. I'm going to pick 2. That's pretty standard for a bracketed shot. So we have 3 shots bracketed at 2 stop intervals. So the 0 is an even exposure, and every large tick is 1 stop. Every little tick is 1/3 of a stop. So looking at this little diagram, we have 2 stops underexposed. I know that because this is a negative right here. Even exposure plus 2 stops. And so the camera would take all 3 of those images automatically without touching the camera. And I will demonstrate this technique in the crash course. Multiple exposure mode is something that I don't see as a serious tool. And I often ask myself, how can I make money on a certain feature? Haven't been able to figure it out with multiple exposure, and it's tricky to get good results from. I think it's easier done just to take regular pictures and to bring them into Photoshop. But if you want to try it out, it's kind of fun. You can come in here and turn this on for a single shot or for multiples series. This would stay on until you turn it off. How many shots, how they're overlaid. It's the blending mode in Photoshop. And then you can keep all the exposures. And this overlay thing is kind of fun. You can see what you're doing as you go. But the truth of the matter is it's not a professional tool, in my opinion. High dynamic range is a pretty cool feature. I mean, I've used it occasionally. It doesn't work very well if things are moving. So if you have waves or trees moving around, it doesn't work. But it's something that I think is worth trying out. If you're in a situation where you don't have a tripod and you can't do bracketed shots, it's probably the best thing you're going to have a shot with. The camera will take the images and stack them in camera. We can even save the individual raw images. All you have to do is come in here and turn this on for a single photo or a series of photos. I typically shoot at 2 EV, but auto's fine. Let the camera decide. And so what's going to happen is once this is turned on, camera's going to take multiple images, assemble them together to give you a high dynamic range image. Interval timer shooting. This is telling the camera to take pictures at different intervals. So let's come down here. We can start now, or we can start at a certain date and time. Interval is how much time passes between each shot. And then we have the total number of shots here. So 300 shots, 1 shot each. If we wanted to have multiple pictures taken at each interval, we could do that too. And we have exposure smoothing, which tells the camera how to adjust exposure to make it more even if you have changing lighting conditions. We have the electronic shutter if we want it to be completely silent. And we can even tell the camera to give priority to the interval if you're using longer exposures. Change the storage folder. So the interval timer shooting, we have a full lesson on the crash course where we go down to the beach, we do a sunset, and I show you how to set the camera up, with your exposure. There's a lot more to it than just, telling you how to turn the timer on. And so that lesson's there. Time-lapse movie, the difference between the interval timer shooting and the time-lapse movie is that the camera is supposed to take those images and create a movie file in camera. This is going to be a lot easier if you are not familiar with editing software like Premiere Pro or Final Cut or DaVinci Resolve, where you're taking those images individually and exporting them. If you use the interval timer shooting on the Z7, those are some pretty big files. You can do 8K video. And I'm having some problems right now with the Z6. For whatever reason, it's not saving the movie. So I don't know if I have a glitch with my Z6 or what's going on. But if it's something that is going to be fixed with a firmware update, or maybe something that's with my card, I have no idea. I cannot get it to save the video file. Then I'll do an update on that crash course for it. Focused shift shooting is focus stacking for macro photographers. When you come in here, it's going to ask you the number of shots and how much interval space you want between them. If you want to change, exposure lock, there's some cool peaking stack features. We demonstrate all of this on the crash course. I just shot it yesterday. It's a cool lesson. Essentially what this feature does is it allows the camera to change the focus position. I use a ruler here as a demonstration. And it automates the taking of the pictures. And let me show you something cool. Like if you touch on the bottom screen here and you scrub through your images, you can see the depth of field changing. I'm just scrolling through images, but you can see how that worked. And another cool thing about this is it's perfectly still. Okay, so in the past, macro photographers would have to do this by changing a lens ring, and you'd move the camera, and it'd mess everything up. So macro photographers do this to maintain the optimal sharpness and to stay away from diffraction. And it's a really great tool if you've never heard of it. But again, the full lesson is on the crash course. And then we have our silent photography, which is electronic shutter mode. If you are shooting, let's say, as an on-set photographer for a movie, you'd come in here and turn this on. And that is going to be completely silent. Listen. So that just took a picture, right? Very cool. Now we're coming into the movie shooting menu, and there are a couple things in here that are critically important when we're talking about the differences between the Z6 and the Z7. We can reset the menu just as we did with the stills. There it is. File naming we can change, but this guy right here, choose image area. This is super important to know the difference. For the Z6, I recommend FX. For the Z7, I recommend DX, which is the crop sensor. The reason why this is important is because the video is sampled differently in those two cameras. We have 24 megapixels on the Z6 and then 45.7 megapixels on the Z7. Long story short, there's just too much resolution in the Z7 for the camera to record at full FX and not throw away some data. So what's happening is it's either line skipping or pixel binning. I don't know which one it is. On the Z7, if you shoot in the FX mode, information, lines or pixels of information are going to be tossed out before the video file is made, and it creates a softer image. That is not the case in the DX mode, which uses a smaller part of the sensor, not as much resolution to work through, and therefore it oversamples in DX mode, which is going to have a crop factor of 1.5. So on the Z7, shoot in DX mode for video, but remember your lenses are going to have a magnification factor of 1.5. So if you're using a 10 millimeter lens, it's going to act like a 15 millimeter lens. If you're using a 100 millimeter lens, it's going to be more like a 150 millimeter lens. You can shoot in FX mode, it's just not going to be as sharp or as clean. On the Z6, I'm always shooting on FX mode, and the reason is this is one of the first cameras. There's some Sonys that will do it too, but this is one of the first ones that will shoot 35 millimeter full frame with no crop at 30 frames per second. We get a slight crop on Sony cameras. So most of the video shooting lessons are with the Z6. I think it's a better video camera. I think the Z7 is a better landscape photography camera. Very important distinction between those two. Frame size and frame rate, I'm almost always shooting on 4K 30 frames per second. And these numbers here, this is the resolution, number of pixels wide by the number of pixels tall, frames per second. Video is 30, PAL is 25, film is 24. We also see this 120. That's a high frame rate. And you notice the resolution changes, so that's HD, 120 frames per second. If you shoot there and play back at 30, we would get 4 times slow motion. It's a great tool. We're going to be talking about that in the video section of the crash course. A lot of this stuff. Come back down here, and we can also tell the camera to play back in slow motion. So it'll still record at 120 frames per second, but it'll play it back in slow-mo. Movie quality we can't change because it is already high with this mode. If you picked something like 1080, you would see that change. MOV is what I edit with, and so I'm almost always shooting on MOV. MP4 is a little bit more compatible, but if you're doing any editing, stick with MOV. We have our ISO sensitivity settings, white balance. Both of those can be changed with buttons while we're recording video. And the set picture control is going to be a little bit more important for movies because many videographers like the flat profile here, where they're stripping out a lot of color information and they will add this back in post. So a couple important side notes about this is that the video that we're recording into our camera is a form of JPEG. And we have the ability to export through an HDMI cable to a device to record 10-bit 422. We talk about that on the crash course. The short answer is the vast majority of you try to get it right in camera. Whatever you're shooting, try to get the look and the exposure correct as you are recording it. Do not rely on post-process editing to get it right if you are saving to this memory card. If you are shooting and recording out to an HDMI cable, you do have a little bit more range for editing. It's sort of like a mini RAW file. It's not quite raw video, but there's more information there. And that would make sense to shoot in N-Log with flat and all these other settings that I'll demonstrate in that lesson. But the vast majority of us who are running and gutting and shooting, for YouTube, try to get it right in camera. So I even stay away from the flat profile. I try to get the colors and the exposure and everything right as I'm recording. Why? Because I want minimal editing time. And it's an 8-bit 420 file. You can't really push it very hard without running into some problems. That's the long answer. But we'll be covering a lot of information about video shooting in the crash course. Manage picture control allows us to create our own picture profiles. We would choose a starter one, and then we would adjust it accordingly to these settings here. I think it's better to do out here. So if I'm in video mode, you can do all those things here and get a preview by pushing down. I think it's a good idea to get a preview of what it is you're doing as you're doing it, and even to do some tests before you dial these in and do an important shoot. Just one man's opinion. Active D-lighting I typically have turned off for video. High ISO noise reduction I recommend leaving to normal, as with vignette control and diffraction compensation. The auto distortion control is the Boeing effect again. It depends on the lens you have. Flicker reduction that's different lamps give off this pulsating light that we cannot see with the naked eye, and this allows the camera to shoot in such a way that there is no conflict. Sometimes if you turn this off and you're using a shutter speed that's not quite compatible, you'll notice this flickering or a little band that's kind of moving up the screen. Metering we talked about already. Talked about the focusing modes, the focusing clusters. Vibration reduction we can turn off in the eye menu, but this is another place we can do it. Electronic vibration reduction I also leave turned off. Microphone sensitivity I recommend to manual here. And we want to stay away from the red there. So I turn that down, and I usually have a microphone plugged into the camera. We'll be talking about this on the crash course, which microphones and how to use them and how to clean up audio, all that stuff. Really good info. I'm going to stick with manual. So when you see that number out here instead of an A, you're on the manual. Attenuator I never use. Doesn't really work that well. It's designed to cut off really loud noises. Frequency response, typically on wide, and then we have our headphone volume and our time code, which allows us to see. This is going to be more important with the HDMI lesson. I'll show you how to set that up. So we're coming into the custom settings. There's a lot of custom controls in here. The two that I want to share with you now, we cover all of these on the crash course, and so the crash course has a full menu section where I go through everything and every setting. The two in here that are really important are F1, right here, which is going to allow us to customize the eye menu. So as you're shooting in the stills mode, this eye menu here, see how we have all these controls? F1 allows us to customize them. So we can determine what we want on our menu. So if there's something that you use often, but not like between every shot, pretty good place to put in the eye menu. And then the same is true for video mode. The G1 also can customize it. Here it is. Those are two different eye menus, depending on the mode that we're shooting in. The other ones that you should recognize are the custom control assignment, which allows us to recognize a button and change literally what it does. Talked about that with back button focusing. Very useful. And the same is true also for movie. There's some custom controls. There's a lot of information in here, and again, we cover this all in the crash course. So coming down to the setup menu, the format memory card is going to erase everything. We can save all the user settings to a memory card and transfer it to another camera. We can reset the user settings, obviously English, got our time zone, monitor brightness. A lot of this stuff is pretty self-explanatory. On the crash course, I show you how to clean the sensor, the techniques that I use and the tools that I use. Image comments and copyright information, we can come in and add information that we want. We type it in here. HDMI stuff we'll be talking about on the crash course is you can output to an HDMI recorder. Location data has to do with a GPS unit that we put on the camera. You can see it's not on here right now. No GPS built into the camera. It's a very important distinction. Then we have our wireless remote. So a lot of this stuff, airplane mode. We have a lesson on Wi-Fi that I'm going to show you right after this lesson. Conformity marking, anti-release lock, so we can change the settings. So I'm looking for the most important stuff. We have our battery indicator. Come back out. I cover all these on the crash course. We go through each and every one of these. I'm just looking for the most important. So the retouch menu allows us to do some light editing or cropping to certain images. It's something that you might want to check out. I don't recommend using this as a serious tool simply because the monitor is small and you want to see what you're editing in detail. Okay, so you can get away with some things. You can straighten some images, you get distortion fixes and some light raw processing, but these are not serious tools. You can trim the movie too. Look at that. Image overlays, kind of cool, but again, all this can be done much better on a computer. And if you're investing this kind of money into a camera, definitely look at Photoshop or Lightroom for your editing. So my menu is, there's two ways to set this up. We have recent settings, which basically means that if you have this selected, the camera is going to remember the most recent menu items, and so the ones that you use the most often will kind of work their way up to the top. Not a huge fan of it, so I typically go with my menu. This allows us to add specific items. So let's say we go photo shooting here, and I want to have, I don't know, let's find something useful. HDR. So come over here, HDR mode is added, hit OK. So now we have the HDR mode. So the idea is that if there are specific menu items that you like and you use often, you would put them in here. So that's a quick overview of the deep menu system, my recommended settings. I go into far greater detail on the crash course. We go through pretty much everything and I show you all those settings, and we got tons of lessons on the individual features, and I hope you enjoyed it. Let's talk about connecting our camera to a smartphone, which gives us some really cool options. You're going to need to download the SnapBridge app from the App Store or from the Google Play Store. We're going to select the orange tab, connect to smart device. We're going to turn on our Wi-Fi, establish Wi-Fi. It's going to turn on. And while this is going, I need to delete a camera. So I just did another video on the D35. I'm going to forget that camera, get rid of it. Yep, we want to get rid of that. It's telling me to delete the Bluetooth. So if you have another camera in there, we would have to delete the Bluetooth settings before we could repair again. So we're going to come into Add Camera. We're going to come down to the mirrorless camera, Z7, Z6. Wi-Fi connection is available. Choose the method for the camera. We're going to go here. So it's going to tell us essentially to go into our Wi-Fi settings to connect and to type in the password, all that other stuff. So if we're in the settings, we're going to come back out. Here's our Wi-Fi. Hopefully it'll show up. There it is. So the smartphone is now paired with the Wi-Fi of the camera. So once I get to this point, I need to come back to the app, We are now connected by Wi-Fi. Quick bit of history is in the past, SnapBridge has had some problems. The D500 didn't even work. And there is some cool things we can do in terms of remote shooting. Gives us a warning about white balance. And there we are. Really nice. We can come in and change our aperture. Swiping to the left or right. We can change our shutter speed. Changing to the left or right. I'm on the manual mode. Gives us an exposure preview. It's slightly delayed. We can touch on our smartphone to focus. Very nice. ISO. There it is. White balance. We can change our white balance from our smartphone. So there's a lot of cool little things we can do from a remote shooting perspective. This little icon up here tells us that when we shoot this way, we get a 2 megapixel file, number of shots remaining, battery life. We have some settings in here. If you want to download the images, you come in here. It gives us the option to go with the original size. Just know that it's going to be larger. It's going to take some time. If we don't want to automatically download, we could turn that off. I like the live view prediction. We have a timer over here we can turn on. It gives us different options for timers. Really nice. Seems to be working fairly well too. Now we can come over to video mode and we can record video. So you're going to notice that if we're not in the video mode, we can still jump into it. The problem is we don't have the exposure controls that we typically see, but we can start and stop video recording. So a little bit limited on the video stuff. Notice the crop, how it cropped off as well. So that allows us to control the camera remotely using Wi-Fi. Let's come out. There's a cloud feature here that we can upload images if you guys are interested in that. I went hiking with a good friend. This is from the D850 shoot. But anyway, it allows us to see the images. It's not the full size unless we designate it. I like dealing with these smaller megapixels because we can put them on social media. You can be out shooting, and this would give you a way to connect your pictures to, let's say, Instagram or Facebook, and you wanted to share these lower res files. This is where it all happens. We have some other options up here. You can select photos for download. Gives us all the information there. Cancel that, and then we can also end the connection. So do you want to switch to Bluetooth? I am not a fan of the Bluetooth shooting. It just doesn't work quite as well. And then we can also download all the images from our camera. So those other 3 images you saw, those were the 2 megapixel images. In here, we can select which ones we want and then download them. Do you want it's asking, do you want 2 megapixels or do you want the original? Let's go 2 megapixels. So the Wi-Fi download will be canceled after a set period if the app is running in the background. So if we're not using it, it's going to turn off. Battery saving feature, and then we have some new images added. So that is an overview of how to connect to SnapBridge and to use Wi-Fi shooting. When we're talking about accessories for our Nikon Z6 and Z7, and I tell this to all new camera owners, the #1 accessory that you should invest in is a good tutorial. It took me 2 years to learn my first camera, and I was so frustrated I almost quit. When I finally figured it out, I was like, I'm going to make tutorials that will teach students within a couple hours everything they can do with their camera. And that's where my career as an instructor began. And I hope I've earned your trust. But if you don't like my teaching style, find another tutorial that will teach you what you can do with your camera. It's the best bang for the buck investment that you can make. Second accessory, this is a no-brainer, is the FTZ adapter. It's going to allow us to use our F-mount lenses on our Z-mount bodies. There's not a lot of native focusing lenses at the time of this recording, therefore it is a must-have. Third most important accessory is a good tripod. I like the Bogen Manfrotto B-Free, but something with aluminum or carbon fiber legs, preferably with a removable head, and I like the locking ball heads to start. This is going to allow you to take long exposures, set up for video shooting, things of that nature. Fourth most important accessory is going to be something like a speed light. Nikon has a number of great models. I point my students more towards the Godox knockoff version. It's far more affordable. It'll allow you to, try it out. We have a course on the crash course that will show you how to use it. and at least experiment with strobe lighting. If you enjoyed this video and you found it helpful, and I hope it was, you're probably going to be interested in some of the tests that I have coming for these cameras, so I would love your subscription. And for the rest of you, I will see you on the crash course. Thank you for watching and have a great day.